Welcome back to Heart Matters, Living with Intention. So it's December 2022, and over the next few episodes, I'm going to catch up the last couple of years and things that have happened. So I last left you, it was in October 2020. I had a foot infection, which was not great. I had just gone into something called atrial fibrillation, where the heart rate goes from maybe 60, 70 beats a minute, and then it will jump up to say 130, all while you're sitting still and not exercising or doing anything. And it makes you generally very tired, and it feels quite uncomfortable. And that was the main concern that we had at the time, that there was something that needs to happen. And this was discovered after my watch went off. My Apple Watch told me that something was going on. I was in touch with the doctors, and we were then waiting to go to Papworth. Papworth is the specialist heart centre in Cambridge, and they do about 1 in 5 heart transplants each year. So in the UK, there are about 500 transplants each year. And I'd already had one heart transplant assessment, and at the time they said I didn't need a heart transplant, but to come back again in 6 months. So I've been in this 6-month cycle. We're now again coming back to October 2020. Because of my foot infection, the heart transplant assessment had been delayed, so they had wanted to see me sooner, but one of the tests for the heart transplant is to do a walking test and a cycle test or various tests, and with my foot at that time, I wasn't able to do those tests. So we pushed it back a few weeks. In the meantime, I had been put on some new drugs to try and get the atrial fibrillation under control. And the first drug was amiodarone, which goes very much deeper into the system. So it takes a few weeks to go into the system and also to come out of the system. And they start you on a high dosage, I think it's 400 mg, and then the idea is to take that down gradually, but you shouldn't really be on that drug for over a year maximum. And I'll come and talk about amiodarone a bit later. But the other drug that they also put me on because my heart changed and was so erratic was bisoprolol. They ended up putting me on these 2 drugs in the run-up to this heart transplant assessment. I remember feeling gradually worse and worse, and over the course of 3 days, my heart rate resting went from 65, 70 down to 50. And I could barely get out of bed. It was really challenging. And I remember contacting the doctor, again with information from my Apple Watch, which I really want to emphasize, whilst it's not a medical device that can monitor what's going on, it was really useful for me to give me peace of mind and understanding. I know I could feel how I could feel, but being able to send the doctor, look, I've got this information and this is how I'm feeling, what should I do? And immediately they responded saying, stop the bisoprolol, because the 2 drugs together were forcing my heart rate to go much further down than it should. And so immediately I could see a change, which was good in a good way, that my heart rate was then coming up back to a normal rate despite the atrial fibrillation still continuing. And I think had I not done that, I might have then been put on the transplant list perhaps sooner. And again, I'll explain a little bit more about that. So in terms of when the atrial fibrillation then started to when I went to Papworth, I was really fortunate to be able to stay with my parents. So I spent a good few weeks with my dad, and I went to stay with my mum as well in Oxford. It was a really challenging time. My feet swelled up, and to do with the heart failure and water retention, which again, it's the symptoms during that time have been the worst that they've been in 5 years. There were times when I literally struggling to get out of bed, struggling to breathe. I couldn't walk. I remember trying to walk up the road where I grew up with a friend and with my mum as well, going for a walk, and just really struggling. A combination, my foot was still healing, so that was one impediment as it were, but also this breathlessness and the tiredness and really struggling. Throughout this time, what I'm really grateful for is the work I was still doing with my clients as a coach. And I would get up, I just remember there was the struggle, but get up, have a shower, be ready, do a client session for an hour, and I sitting still and being there and being present and helping other people on their journey, which at the time felt like that's the one thing that I can do. And then stopping and then going back to bed, and I had a very limited time for around a month or so. It was then really thinking, obviously this is serious, and the apprehension then coming up of potentially needing to go on the transplant list and having a transplant. And if every day was like those days, then I definitely would and should have gone on the transplant list. So coming back to this weekend, I think it was the 7th of October, I just stopped taking bisoprolol, And I had the heart transplant assessment on the Monday morning, and my brother and Michael agreed to take me to Cambridge. So we were going to stay in Cambridge the night before, because often the transplant assessment is very early in the morning, just to be there and being in space. And I remember, even whilst I was feeling a bit better, and I remember I went for a walk with my dad just before we left in the car, that I could actually walk around the park. It was a bit of a miracle that, again, the drugs, they need to do what they do, but it was just too much for me and for my body, and it was the right thing to stop the bisoprolol. I remember then, even on the motorway going up to Cambridge, getting out and just feeling so lightheaded and like I was going to collapse. And it was a horrible feeling. And we got to the hotel. Michael took me to the hospital the following day, where I then had a number of tests. The tests included a walking test, which I mentioned because my foot would have been very difficult to do. And that's the first time I think I properly walked a good distance. It was a number of steps where you need to walk between two different points, back and forth. The other big test that they did, some x-rays of my lungs, they did the blood tests, but they also did a right heart catheterization where they go in through the neck, which I've described a bit before, but I'll give it a go again. They go in whilst you're awake, and they do that so that you can breathe and see how the heart's responding to your breath. So there's a number of directions that they do. So they put a small local anesthetic in the side and then go in, and it's a weird feeling. I also learned you don't have, I think this is right, I'm sure someone might comment if it's wrong, but you don't have nerve endings inside the body. Whilst you've got the anesthetic on the outside, they can go in and prod around. You don't actually, it's the nerve endings, I think that's what it is. Anyway, you don't feel it inside, but you feel that there's something happening. And we came out of that, and yeah, it was a weird sensation of kind of this feeling, because how much of it was the bisoprolol, the impact on my foot, and thinking, do I need a transplant or not? And waiting for then the results of what the doctors are going to tell me what's needed and perhaps what's changed since my last transplant assessment. A few key things have changed. The BNP protein level, which I've mentioned before, is a marker that if your heart is damaged or you have a heart attack, there'll be a protein in the blood. When I was originally diagnosed, Papworth, when they said I needed my first transplant assessment, that figure was around 3,000. And it's oscillated between 3,000 and 5,000 over time, but it was now actually at 14,000. So that was one big alert and a marker that was of concern. The other thing, though, that was of concern was the fact that with the right heart catheter, there's a percentage, from how I understand it, of capacity that your heart is running. And previously it was at 51%. And so it was borderline. If it's below 50, that's then when you should really go onto the transplant list. And at this stage, it came back and it was 49%. There was this very much, for the first time, a more considered suggestion. And it was very much a suggestion that it was up to me to make the choice, but if I did decide to go on the list for a transplant, then they would support that decision. And based on everything, that they would support it. And if at this stage I decided not to, they would also support it. They also said if they could see that I was in denial or I was ignoring this big, I said the elephant in the room, and I was saying no, or actually I did really need it, then they would have pushed back on me. But at the time, in my head, when you take a step back and think about like quality of life, which is one of the things that is so important, is will the heart transplant give me a better quality of life? And based on the last month, I would have said yes. Like, I can't live the rest of my life feeling in the way that I felt and struggling to breathe, struggling to walk. It was no life, and I would have definitely. But what was interesting, because of that bisoprolol and that change, even in the last 24 hours, I'd started to feel better. And I think I made, in that moment, that decision that I said, for now, it was a no. And look, they're keeping very close eye on me. It was the fact that I was going to see them again in 3 months. And if anything changed, I can go back. It's not like it's, I'm going to say, the final decision, but it was the decision, I say, of the day. It's worth recapping again. Look, one of the challenges with the heart transplant is you need to be well enough to be able to have a transplant, and not too ill, and you can definitely go past a window of opportunity that then if you become too ill, the transplant is no longer possible. The other factors to consider is they said on average it can take between 200 and 600 days for me to get a heart. That's a conundrum of going, today I feel okay, but how am I going to feel in perhaps 200 days time, over half a year's time, that then I will actually need to have made that decision earlier. And frustrating, they did say in the future we'll know when the right time was to say yes. The other thing is you can say yes, and they've had experiences where someone's been told they need a heart transplant, and then within less than 24 hours, they were called back into hospital and they were given a new heart. And again, it's measuring up all of these different emotions and feelings and why. And I guess the real decision I made was, look, is my quality of life going to improve? And based on last month, yes. But if I'm now feeling better, and based on how I was feeling before also the infection on my foot and how I was feeling, I just didn't feel like that was the right time. And I went home as well, then even questioning that decision. Was that the right decision? And I remember them calling me the following day, having a follow-up. And I shared with them, have I made the right decision? And they said, look, for now, that's the decision you've made. And if you feel like anything is changing or you deteriorate again sooner, then do let us know. And yeah, that was that next kind of episode. I liken it to this different kind of analogies. You've got this, it's just such a fine line. I've said this in the past and I'll probably say it again, this like similarities between entrepreneurship and my heart journey of the appetite for risk and this fine line between success and failure. It's like you can be so close, and if you just kept going, you could succeed and you don't know what's around the corner, or you could get that next deal, or you get that next appointment, get that next fundraise, whatever it is. And on the other side as well, like knowing also when to stop and when's time. And I guess both for Student Beans, my first company, when I was starting this drive and resilience just to keep going, and there was something in that. But then with Causa, my second business that I've closed down, it was knowing enough's enough and I need to stop now, and that's the right thing for me. So yeah, that's just maybe some comparisons. I feel fortunate I've had my startup experience to almost help me deal with some of these decisions and what's going on. Thanks for watching. Feel free to check out the British Heart Foundation, Cardiomyopathy UK and Save 9 Lives for more information. Why not comment on the video, tell me what you think or ask a question, and subscribe to the channel to continue to follow my journey.